get onto the real substance of what all this is about. I'm really delighted that this research has taken place. So I should say, my name's Tom McNeill. I'm the Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands, and my office has had involvement in this work. And I'm really delighted it's taken place because I'd say two main things, really. One, it has genuinely told us things that we didn't realise. So it's not just another report restating things that most of us already knew. I mean, a lot of people in this room might have already known, but some of the insights were genuinely new to us. And we see a lot of reports on childhood trauma, for example, and adverse childhood experiences. And it's important that those reports keep on coming, because there's a lot of people that need persuading about the reality of those things. But often they're kind of restating things that we felt we already knew, whereas this research definitely highlighted a few things that were quite specific and tangible that we could use to really improve in the way that we're commissioning or how we're working with partners. And then the other thing about the research, which is not always the case with research, is that it is very action focused. Again, going to that point about specificity, it's got quite a few recommendations which I think go beyond broad and vague kind of principles. As important as principles often are, it really helps kind of direct towards how can we actually improve substance misuse services for women. So certainly from our perspective, I think the causes of addiction, whether it's drug addiction, alcohol addiction, they can be very complex for the individual, very complex and multifaceted, but they're relatively well understood by, I'd say, researchers and a lot of practitioners, most practitioners. And there nearly is always some relationship with trauma, historic abuse, present abuse and trauma, or other major life challenges interwoven with poverty, using a complex definition of poverty and not simply just low income. And from the Police and Crime Commissioner's perspective, we obviously know it doesn't take a genius to come up with a conclusion, notwithstanding the mountains of evidence, formal evidence, that addiction can lead to crime. It can lead to crime either because people might need to commit it to feed their addiction, or because it interweaves with other problematic behaviour when intoxicated or whatever else. And our view, and we're obviously party to this, so this isn't about us pointing the finger at other people, it's taking responsibility as well. Our view is that the criminal justice system is really not succeeding at tackling these vulnerabilities. It's not succeeding in identifying always addictions. Often it does, but often it doesn't. And it's certainly not good enough yet at addressing the underlying causes. Again, trauma and all the associated problems. And then when we look very specifically at the issue of women with substance misuse problems, the system is really failing to grapple many of those coexisting issues or historic issues around domestic abuse and sexual violence. We believe, we understand, we see the evidence that for men caught in criminal justice as a result of addiction, they too have nearly always had a history of trauma and other social problems, and absolutely nothing about this research is about denigrating that experience or pretending that doesn't happen. But this is about highlighting those extra layers of injustice that too many women in society face. Essentially, suffering at the hands very often of male dominance and abuse. And obviously not every case of substance misuse involves domestic abuse and sexual violence or histories of it, or coercive control, but a very significant amount has. And so we recognise that as one of the primary examples around why substance misuse among women needs really special attention to work out its prevalence, but also really what does work to help get them the help that they need. So this is as much a piece about social justice as it is about anything else. It would be wrong to open this up without giving a huge thank you to the people that have really pushed this work, because it wasn't us thinking, oh, this would be a great idea. This work has really been brought to us, and we're lucky that it has, and we've been the lucky recipients of the wisdom that's come from it. So the Jabs Foundation are extremely passionate about women and justice and the injustice of so many women being pushed through a system that is not dealing with their trauma and their needs. Staffordshire University, obviously the lead academic institution, I'll leave them to talk about what they've done in this work. And expert citizen CIC being a really powerful part in bringing the voice of women and people who've been through the system or going through the system right to the forefront of this, which is more than a little bit fundamental if we're really going to understand how to improve things. And of course, Centre for Justice Innovation, who've been involved in this at every stage and are a really important partner to us, full stop. So just a final couple of points then before we really move on to the most important bit, which is getting into the substance of what this this launch and the report is really trying to tell us, is we lead lots of research, we conduct lots of research, we commission lots, which is very good at highlighting problems. And, you know, my day job is spent pointing out problems to people and internally day in, day out, hour by hour. But I really like the solutions focused of this. And the research has been particularly helpful for us because the people who've commissioned it have really tried to come along with a journey with us and working with our partners and other commissioners to try and land it. And we've held more than one event to try and do that, and we will continue to do that because it's not enough to have a report on a shelf. We all need to be talking about how do we make this a reality, and of course the big barriers to making that a reality. And one of those is I feel it's really important to acknowledge this because in the report it says we need some specific extra provision for women. The details of that will come out. I think it's important for us to be really honest about the impact of austerity. There's lots and lots of practitioners I speak to day in, day out who know what would improve things, but they just can't deliver it yet because they don't have the resource, or they've lost refuge and residential services, or they've lost the ability to do outreach. So there's a huge amount of knowledge there that if they had the resource, they could deliver on it. Notwithstanding that, you know, when I talk about the police context, policing has lost, well, thousands of police officers in the West Midlands, and that's made a huge dent in what we're able to do. But we can, of course, always improve. We can evolve. And just because we don't have as much resource as we were doing before, it doesn't mean we were doing everything brilliantly. And there were tweaks and amendments and evolution we could do to improve things for the people we're working with. And I think that's exactly what this research goes to. Yes, there's a much, much better future that I think we need to invest in, and we need new levels of resource in it. And I hope that's what we get. But until then, there are some things we can do to improve. So I'm going to end there with that little introduction. That's the context of this. I think it's fantastic research, genuinely proud to be anywhere near associated with it, even though I've not done the hard work whatsoever. And I'm going to pass this over to the first presentation, which is from Stephen and Sarah from Centre for Justice Innovation and Staffordshire University, respectively, and they're going to talk through the research findings. So over to you, Stephen and Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I'm Stephen Whitehead. I'm the I'm the head of data and evidence at the Centre for Justice Innovation. For those of you who don't know us, we're a charity that works around reform of the UK's criminal and family justice systems. We do research like this, we advocate for policy change at every level, and we work directly with practitioners on the ground to make change happen. And as part of that work, we're developing a strand that looks at all of the issues affecting women with complex needs, both within and without the justice system. So we were really excited to have the opportunity, funded by the PCC in the West Midlands and the Jazz Foundation, to do this work. And we've done it in partnership with Staffordshire University and Expert Citizen CIC. And presenting on that side of things is going to be Sarah Page. Sarah, do you just want to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Page. I'm an Associate Professor in Social Justice and Social Learning at Staffordshire University, and I work within our Research Centre for Crime, Justice and Security.
Thanks, Sarah. As throughout the project, it's great to have you with us. And we've had, just to say that, we've had lots of really great contributors to this work. Hannah Jeffrey, who's I think on this call somewhere, has been really helpful in making a lot of the kind of fieldwork happen and sorting through the insights. Fiona and Sophie at Staffordshire University, Fiona McCormack and Sophie Oldfield, and Tracy Knight and Sophia Federich, expert citizens as well, who really lent their skills to bringing out the voice of women in treatment in a kind of really powerful way. So thanks for that. So in terms of this presentation, I'm going to talk you through a little bit about the background to the research and how we kind of place it in the policy context, and what's kind of what we know about lives of women and girls who might be having treatment. And then I'm going to throw over to Sarah, who's going to talk in a bit more detail about the kind of the insights that really came out about the lives of women in treatment and their pathways into treatment. Then I think I'll talk a little bit more about what we saw in terms of what treatment is being offered and the kind of strengths and weaknesses of that. And finally, some recommendations that we had around how treatment services can work a little better. After our presentations, we've got people from the Nelson Trust, which is a really exciting provider of the treatment services in a way that are kind of really specifically targeted to meet the needs of women. And we're going to ask them to talk a little bit more about their work and their experiences. And at the end of that, there'll be a Q&A session where you can ask any of the presenters questions about our work. There should be a Q&A panel that you can access through a button at the top. So feel free, as burning questions emerge, as any of us are talking, to throw your questions in there. And then we'll kind of revisit that when everyone's had the chance to do their presentations. So just to say a little bit more about this work, I mean, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, we kind of recently in 2021 saw the release of the Dan Carroll Black Review into drug, the last part of the Black Review into drug treatment. And that's a kind of really wide-ranging document. But one of the things it's important to highlight is that that review recognised that women are what it described as an underserved or not well-served group in terms of drug treatment. And in that, they particularly link that to the change in the environment and the kind of closure of many smaller providers who might have a kind of specialist offer there. In their response to the Black Review from Harm to Hope, which, although not providing, I think, necessarily everything we'd like, does put more money into the treatment system than was there previously, the government did recognise again women and girls as an underserved group and talked about the need for better monitoring and better information about how to support them, but didn't really offer kind of concrete ideas or guidance on what that might look like. For us as an organisation which got to start in the criminal justice system, when we think about support for vulnerable women, we often refer back to the Corsten report back in 2006, which really brought to the fore this model of women's centres for vulnerable women. That's going to really specialist services that respond to women's needs around trauma, around every aspect of their life, but do it in a person-centered and asset-based way that's kind of really positive and targeted to help women move forward. I think the aspiration to have that kind of support available everywhere is something that's been more spoken about than necessarily realised, but it does continue to be a kind of framework for strategy in the criminal justice system, and something that, you know, we kind of refer back to when we think about what we think support for specialist women would look like. I mean, especially support for women would look like. So in terms of our work, we really set out with a particular focus on the West Midlands to look at how substance misuse treatment was responding to women's specific needs, how women were experiencing treatment. And that had two elements to it. It had a policy review. It was kind of a set of desk-based research. We looked over the policy documents, like the ones I've just shown you, and about the existing evidence on what works well for women in treatment, and what data could tell us about women in treatment. But the core part of our work was actually going out and speaking to people. So myself and Hannah at the Centre for Justice Innovation, we spoke to practitioners, both who are delivering substance misuse treatment and in other services working with the same kinds of women, whether it's like women's centres, specialist sex work services, other kind of specialist organisations. And then Sarah and colleagues at Staffordshire University and Expert Citizens spoke to service users themselves, obviously really important, and then held a session, a World Cafe session, where we could share our emerging findings and check those with experts, including practitioners and other people. So I'm going to hand over now to Sarah to say a little bit more about the methodology that they use and then to launch into the findings.
Yeah, a really important part of our research was our partnership with Expert Citizens CIC. And Expert Citizens is a group of lived experience experts leading an organisation for people with lived experience to input into policy and practice. And so we were thrilled to be able to work with them to co-design the research methodology and questions, and also to co-collect data together and to process that data for these findings. So the solutions that we're presenting today and the recommendations are all driven by the voices of women with lived experience as well as professionals. So I'll move on to talk a little bit about the findings. I'm mostly going to focus on the findings of women with lived experience, and I want to start with talking a little bit about the relationship between domestic abuse and sexual exploitation in relation to substance misuse as well. I want to make sure that I highlight the voices of the women that we chatted to. So there's two quotes here. For me, I think you're able to be vulnerable and without the risk of predatory males seeking out your vulnerability to, because you can become a target in any service, but especially around drugs. And there are a lot of predatory males. Many of the women talked about how if they were in mixed gender services, the males that were present would target females and sexually exploit them and groom them into relationships. And they also talked about how many of these males were domestically violent in those relationships as well. So we see a real vulnerability for women engaged in treatment. And that vulnerability may have been throughout a lifetime. One woman here says, I've had partners who I've told certain things that I've done on my life and they've thrown it in my face. And the same was true for in mixed gender services. When women talked about their personal experiences in group settings, they felt very much that men present would throw that in their faces and use that to manipulate or coerce them in some shape or form. So we can see here a very clear issue when we have women present with males who are maybe preying upon women in terms of exploiting them to pay for drugs for both themselves and also for the woman too, and that can really hinder a woman in her recovery. If we move on to the next slide. We found that the majority of women had some form of adverse childhood experience, and most of the women talked about starting to use substances, including alcohol, at the age of 14. Here, one of the women says, I've got childhood traumas, I've got all sorts, throughout my life. I've had a hell of a lot of physical and mental abuse. Here we have another woman who said, I was 15 when I met him, referring to an ex-partner. He used to beat the shit out of me. The practitioners talked about how 99% of the women that they worked with were basically using substances to self-medicate from the trauma that they've been through. And so in this context, we also wanted to find out whether or not services were addressing this trauma. And in the main, they weren't. And the lack of trauma support to have processed a lifetime of trauma for many of these women who repeatedly had been involved in exploitative and abusive relationships, and the abuse that they had gone through as a childhood simply wasn't there. And very often women increased their drug and alcohol consumption if they did disclose the trauma that they've been through, or if they started to undergo some form of treatment. We would expect to see some levels of substance and alcohol misuse increasing as a result of that. So women very much had low self-esteem and self-worth from their experiences, and this had significant impacts upon mental health. So the next slide, Stephen. We also found that a lot of women had some form of caring responsibilities. They tended to be the main caregiver within a family context. And there was a mixture in terms of women who had had children removed and put into looked after care, and women who still were the sole responsible person for the children. And in both of those contexts, there were struggles that women had with services. One particular struggle is that of if you are fully responsible for your children, what do you do when you have a school holiday for 6 weeks in the summer and you need to access treatment and you can't go because there's no childcare provided for you within services? So some very practical things that created barriers for women in accessing services, along with women who might attend a service with a pram and have very few places that they can put the pram safely and manoeuvre the child up and down series of stairs safely in that context. So there's a number of practical issues that women face as a result of that, as well as trauma. Women talk to us about feeling traumatized from children being removed from them, and talked about that increasing again and being triggering for them in increasing alcohol and drug usage. So here we have a woman saying a lot of feelings came back when I had children trapped and I went further and further down. And we have another woman here saying in 6 weeks holidays you get no one to have the kids, you can't come and do groups like this. And another woman here commenting about how when she was in a child protection conference, the comment from the drugs worker was that she had used when she hadn't, and that could have led to the child being removed, which initiated a lot of panic for that particular person. So we have a lot of issues that women face, and women who have been abused as children, when they end up having children themselves, that again can trigger the trauma that they've been through as a child, and that can also exacerbate drug and alcohol usage. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about stigma. Many women felt that there was stigma associated to their drug and alcohol usage. At the bottom here, we've got a quote saying, it's across the board, isn't it, in hospitals as well. So I've been in hospitals before and the hospital staff have just been not very nice. You're a heroin addict, then they kind of like when they're doing the medication, they'll leave you till last. You're nearly ready to walk out the door to go and school because of the pain that you're experiencing. In that particular scenario, there was a drugs worker present in that focus group who conferred and said, yes, I've been to sessions in hospital and accompanied women, and it's been very obvious that staff have been rude and disrespectful to the women, and there's been some form of discrimination that has taken place, and as a result the particular staff member had made a formal complaint. And so women talked about in all spheres of engaging in different services, experiencing discrimination and being spoken down to in some shape or form. Women also acknowledged that sometimes their behaviour was detrimental. So for women who are intoxicated may have hit a police officer, for example, that they weren't surprised then that they had had some kind of negative response from those police officers. However, they felt that a black mark was against them, and for future interactions that label had stuck for them. And so there needs to be a little bit of consideration to that. There also needs to be consideration in how we stigmatise people by the names above the doors. Here we see a specialist women's practitioner say, welcome to the drug and alcohol service over the door, rather than a discrete building. You don't want to be seen in that context. And certainly we found from talking to a number of women and professionals that certain women from their cultural background, for example, or religious background, wouldn't feel comfortable entering such a building. Next slide, please, Stephen. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Sarah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how treatment is being delivered and those kind of strengths and weaknesses of those models. So I think the first thing to talk about is treatment sites, and we're saying that we looked at 3 services in the West Midlands, and of them only one had any women-only sites that they told us about, and that was only for a small number of the women that they were working with. So our finding is that almost all the services were giving almost all their women support in mixed gender sites, and that was seen as a real barrier for women. I think Sarah's already talked really powerfully about how those safe spaces can be unsafe for women, about how there can be targeting of exploitative or abusive behaviour at women who are seen as vulnerable because they're accessing those sites. You know, we heard particular examples of women who came face to face with former abusers who are also kind of using treatment services, as well as this kind of being targeted for exploitation. But that was the most acute part of a sense that these were not really welcoming or safe spaces. You know, as we've already alluded to, it can be very stigmatizing entering those spaces, and that they were just seen as difficult to be in. They were chaotic, they were unsafe, they were intimidating, and particularly for women who, as we've discussed, might have a burden of trauma, that could be a really off-putting part of accessing treatment. And, you know, again, we've also noted that women are much more like the men to have primary childcare responsibilities. And because these were such unwelcoming spaces, women didn't feel able to bring their children a lot of the time, and that really acted as a practical barrier to them accessing the treatment that they needed. In terms of key working, all the services that we saw would, as you expect, offer one-to-one key working relationships. These were seen as one of the most important drivers of successful recovery. But there was a real sense that there was a challenge for practitioners in building relationship, particularly with female service users who had a heavier burden of trauma, who might find it more difficult to form relationships, and particularly if that trauma had been in an institutional setting, whether it's difficult experiences while in care, having children removed by the state, having traumatizing experiences while in contact with the criminal justice system. These could all create real barriers to them in forming relationships with practitioners. From some of the specialist providers, the women's centres, the sex worker clinics, we heard really interesting examples of how they could invest a lot of time in that relationship building. They can invite women to come in for a cup of tea and then just to see the service, and then start to build towards a place where effective key working is possible. But we really heard strongly from drug treatment practitioners that their high caseloads and stricter timescales made it more difficult for them to form those relationships. Another interesting factor was around female key workers. 2 of the 3 services that we saw always offered women a choice of a female key worker. The 3rd didn't, although, again, you know, I think that there were a large number of women in their key worker team, but still some women in that service might have a male key worker and not welcome that. And we did hear that that could be important, particularly in terms of divulging some of the factors like difficult childhood abuse, sexual abuse, domestic abuse that might be underpinning women's substance misuse. So that was seen as an issue as well. In terms of group work and peer support, again, 2 of the services that we spoke to offered women-only groups, 1 of them didn't. For women and practitioners who had experience of mixed gender groups, there was a general sense that they didn't work as well for women, that women would be, again, reluctant to disclose some of the difficult experiences that might be underpinning their substance misuse in a mixed gender environment, particularly for a fear of receiving skepticism or kind of dismissal. By comparison, female-only groups were seen as really important and useful. Women not only talked about disclosing things that they found traumatic, but actually by sharing in those groups, sometimes identifying abusive or problematic patterns in current relationships that they hadn't necessarily identified before that. Some of the practitioners that we spoke to also talked about how they could use those women-only groups as a platform to deliver other kind of gender-specific services, whether it was advice about sexual health or it was contact with other relevant services. And so that was seen as a kind of really positive platform when it was available, which wasn't everywhere. Outside of the strict delivery of treatment service, we did hear about real barriers for women in accessing some of the other services that might be really relevant to their recovery. We've heard about the importance of domestic abuse as a factor. We've heard about the kind of high prevalence of trauma. But access to mental health services that might help women deal with that trauma was seen as really difficult, with often sometimes like actual bars to women accessing those services while they're still using, which is problematic if you're using to address your mental health. It's sort of a catch-22, or longer waiting times and poor care. And practitioners that really spoke to us about how they tried to form relationships with local mental health providers and had found that very difficult. Another area of shortage was around supported accommodation, particularly around refuges. Most refuges were seen as completely inaccessible to women who are still using substances. Again, a problem if your abuser is using your substance abuse as a lever of coercion. Although we did, in a kind of more recent visit to the West Midlands, find that one local authority has now commissioned a complex needs service which is accessible to women in use. So there is progress there, but for a lot of women that will still be a bar to them accessing refuges, and that's part of a broader picture where women would really struggle to access safe and appropriate accommodation. So those are some of the things that we saw about how treatment was working. In terms of recommendations, we've really put these into what I sort of think of as tiers, and this is your baseline. I feel like these 4 recommendations are basic standards which every service should meet if it's going to give women a kind of safe and appropriate experience of treatment. And the first of those is appropriate treatment locations. We've heard about how challenging and unsafe those locations that can be. So all women should have access into a location where they can safely and comfortably access treatment, where they can potentially bring children. We've heard different thinking about where that might be. Some people at local authorities are now putting services in kind of high traffic spaces like shopping centres, others in family hubs, others working with women's centres. There's a lot of options, but it's clear that particularly for things like group work, which are more easy to move around than accessing a script, women need to be able to access those in the right places that are accessible. Secondly, women-only group work. I think it does seem that all women should certainly be offered women-only group work. There is some research suggesting that not all women would want that, but it shouldn't be denied to any woman that wants it. Equally, a same-gender key worker. And then lastly, and I think this applies to male service users as well, but I think it would particularly salient for women because of childcare responsibilities, all service users should be able to make appointments at a time which works for them, given their other commitments in their lives. So not at school drop-off and pick-up time, maybe with more flexibility in the school holidays, maybe working around work, maybe working around other service appointments like probation. And yes, this is sort of a fairly obvious thing, but in our findings, this wasn't always happening, or women didn't always perceive that they had this. Secondly, at kind of slightly deeper level, we think that services need to enhance their capacity to meet the specific gendered needs of women. And I think the first thing that underpins this is trauma-informed care. We've heard about how women are likely to have kind of unresolved trauma, and that needs to be addressed. And I think we did meet lots of practitioners that were aware of trauma and trying to put trauma into their own responses, but I think that needs to be broadened with training for all practitioners, but it also needs to be expanded to think about the culture of services, about making sure that there is time for as much as we can, given high caseloads and kind of resource constraints, time for relationship building, a sense of collaboration rather than coercion. And I think it was really brought home to us that because of women's enmeshment in the criminal justice system or in the child protection system, that there was a lot of implicit coercive power afforded to substance misuse workers who might whose judgments might inform women's progress in those other systems which have a lot of direct coercive power. And that's something that really needs to be factored into practice and into the kind of culture of services. Secondly, domestic abuse awareness. We did hear from practitioners that they were worried that their colleagues might not always recognise more subtle forms of domestic abuse, coercive control, things that are not resulting in obvious injury, or that they might not necessarily have the skills to respond to that in a way that's both effective and doesn't raise women's level of risk. So there's a kind of clear need for treatment there. And thirdly, I think we heard, and there's much more in the report about barriers to accessing services for women from some ethnic minority and cultural groups. I don't think actually in this research we really got under the skin of what that was. Partly because we were figured to be in treatment, we weren't really able to kind of speak to enough women from minority groups or specialist providers. So I don't think we can give a kind of clear recipe for how that's resolved, but I do think there's a need for more research and more practice improvement. Finally, I think there's a real sense that we need to look at how these treatment services fit into the kind of range of services and the range of needs that women present with. At kind of at one level, there's a kind of co-location that really feeds into what we're thinking about appropriate spaces for services, but also might help women access services like women's centres and other relevant services, or might help women who are receiving other forms of support start to gain access to treatment. I think that's a clearly effective model, though it requires resources, and actually thinking about how you kind of make that resource efficient for treatment services. Secondly, I think there needs to be a kind of effort across the system to ensure that women have access to all of the services that might be relevant to them, and that their misuse is, as far as possible, not a bar to accessing those services. So that comes back to refuge, social housing, mental health treatment, and other forms of services, perhaps like advice and support, as well as ensuring that those services are set up with, where they're available, clinically proven interventions like EMDR that really respond to treatment, that respond to trauma. And finally, to kind of look broader, I think there's a need for a whole systems approach. You know, we see whole systems approaches to working with women in the criminal justice system in areas like Greater Manchester. And it's great to think about what would that mean for women in the treatment system? How can we take on that idea that there needs to be women, that gender-specific whole person treatment at the heart of a system that informs the values of every part of that system, and which has as many women as possible moving through every part of the system can have access to. And I think that's still something that we'd like to develop when more work and more thinking is needed. But I think it's a challenge for not just treatment providers, but commissioners, but other services, but every part of the system working with vulnerable women to think how they can come together to ensure a joined up and appropriate approach. So that is everything from me. And now I think I'm hoping that we have Kirsten. Well, I'll hand over to Tom to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well done for getting across so much content and background there. That was really good to both of you. So on the agenda I've got, next up we have Carmela to talk about from a lived experience perspective. So Carmela, it's over to you.
Hi, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Stephen, for that. I think this report is absolutely amazing. It actually touched a lot of it. It's really close to my heart because as I've got lived experience of all this, and it's exactly how I felt. Just want to talk about my lived experience, going through services. There were barriers to accessing services, the 9 till 5. I come from a traumatic background of loss and grief and abuse, and I didn't have the tools to help me heal from those traumas. So, I went down the route of addiction, just to escape my reality, really. And the barriers that I faced with services when I was out there in active addiction was the 9 till 5. There was no creativity around my timings of the day. All those statements, Sarah, that you mentioned, that I was like, yeah, me too, straight away. The hospital admissions, I've written some little notes down, and you touched on it as well. Addiction doesn't get taken into consideration. It feels very judgmental in there, and they do lead you to a laugh. That was my experience as well. And it was not a nice place to be. Being in addiction is a very lonely place already. And not having any connection, which is what addiction is. The opposite to addiction is connection. And I didn't have that when I was out there in my using. Mental health services weren't touching me. That was another barrier. Until you stop taking drugs, we cannot help you. So even when the help, I thought people would help me, I was kept on getting rejected, and that on top of my trauma, being rejected because of my abuse from previous, it was exactly the same experience, and it didn't help me at all. I felt always judged. I felt there was a lack of understanding about, us women and the complex needs that we come with, the addiction side of things, what lengths we go to get our next fix. And it's not because I wanted to take the drugs. I didn't wake up one day and think I want to smoke drugs. It's because I was really unwell, and I was not nurtured into a healthy environment to actually, you know, grow as a woman and live life on life's terms. I couldn't do that. You know, I did access, and those statements are so true from those women. I accessed services when there were males there. You know, when I accessed drug and alcohol services, there were males there that I know, and straight away, you know, the next thing you know is the attachment to that. Let's go and get some drugs. Let's go do this. You know, before you know it, you're committing crime. I was in the criminal justice system as well, you know, and it's forever. Something needs to, you know, on the criminal justice side of things, they were giving me appointments at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. That's not my lifestyle. You know, my choices were my choices, but I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop that. You know, I didn't have the willpower to stop. I didn't know there were services out there to help me. And pretty much on this report, you know, it spoke about, a lot of it screamed out Nelson's Trust. That's who helped me in my darker times. You know, they were, I didn't like women, if I'm honest, you know, and it's only till the Nelson's Trust kept on being consistent with me and being out there with the outreach van and giving me that little connection to life and believing that I can do better for myself. And they helped and guided me and supported me to actually find a different way of life. And I never thought that life would be possible today. You know, sometimes I pitch myself that, how did I get here? Like from the depths of addiction and to what I've been through. You know, a lot of my story is like abuse, rapes, everything that those women have made statements for. And there was no clear pathway of, this is what you need to do. Let's help you do this. The only people that helped me do that was the Nelson's Trust. And that I'm really passionate. I feel really tearful actually, because it really has touched me today. The Nelson's Trust is a women's service, and they are a one-stop shop, holistic approach, trauma informed. Rather than saying to me, like, what's wrong with you? It was, what happened to you? You know, when someone said that to me, someone was actually prepared to listen to my voice and tell me, I'm hearing you. I'm going to be with you and walk alongside you. Just let us help you. I thought I was a nobody, that no one didn't care. You know, that was my distorted thinking and my reality of my world. I was able to access the Nelson's Trust, like everything you spoke about in that report. You know, that, you know, and women with lived experience. Like I work now in the service that believed in me. You know, my life has completely changed, and I help those women access and show them there is another way out. You know, I did have adverse childhood experiences and traumatic experiences. I did suffer and still do sometimes with low self-esteem and self-worth. You know, it's really important. Like, our women's services here, I work out in the community services, and I go out to these women. I used to be a sex worker, and I go out to these women who are sex working as well, and I can hear where they're at. I know where they're at, and it's just like reaching on a different level to say, I hear you, I see you, let me help you, and be really creative around, you know, the barriers that we're facing. You know, I couldn't access a GP, I couldn't access a hospital appointment. The only time I'd access that is when I've been arrested and being taken from custody to the hospital, you know, and being cuffed as well, just to add on top of that. You know, it's just, it was not, it was, that's more trauma as well. You know, I think that I'm not blaming the services, because ultimately, you know, they weren't set up correctly. They didn't have the resources. That's what's happened. But like the Nelson's Trust, you know, which what I've experienced in the Nelson's Trust, they're trauma informed. They sit me in a safe space. It's a nice, clean environment. They talk to me. They keep being consistent. If they don't hear from me, they want to come out and find me. You know, no one did that for me for years when I was lost out there, and that felt like I was on my own. You know, even I had like associates, other users, but that's what we're drawn to. And it's not because I wanted to commit crime, it's because I needed what I needed to get to help me escape my reality. I don't want to sit in my own head. My head was not very nice talking to me. It was telling me I'm worthless. I'm a piece of shit. I'm sorry I swore, everybody. I've got no filter. You know, I'm nothing. I'm gonna die a drug addict. That's how I felt. And having combated all these services that, like, no, you need to talk, you need to sort out your drug addiction. No, you need to do that. You need to attend groups. I'm not even capable of attending at a basic appointment. How am I expected to attend group work? You know, in the Nelson's Trust here, we got a safe space for women to come together and talk about trauma in a safe environment, making sure they exit out of the group. They're safe and they're contained. Like, I get where they're at. I've been there where they've been, and the conversations, the level of honesty, like the women are so I hit him on a different level, and it really touches my heart, and it gives me a gentle reminder of what I suffer with every day. You know, addiction is not an addiction, something that I've got to live with for the rest of my life. And I know I can be refunded in an instant. I can be back out there in the madness and be one of those women again saying the same things. But I just find that, you know, we need to be able to access the services, all services, GPs, you know, being really creative around us lot as well, because I feel like I was left to my own devices. Being creative, like when I went to residential treatment, you know, they were, you know, these interventions they gave me, EMDR. I did the Griffin project, which was based around sex, as a sex worker. And that was just a powerful thing. And I actually want to do the cycle twice, so that I couldn't believe that there's a service that will talk to me and want me to open up in front of other vulnerable women as well about what happened during my sex working and my identity, and, you know, and burying that person, because she served me a purpose. She helped me survive in those dark times. Think, you know, that there's so much like the criminal justice system, that for me, that was a big barrier as well. Like, I felt like they were always against me. You know, they weren't working. Like, I cannot get up at 9 o'clock. I cannot get to there at 10 o'clock. I can't get out of bed, out of wherever I am, if I'm sofa surfing, whatever. I was nowhere. I was, you know, I couldn't be pinned down. It was the Nelson's Trust who came and found me every single time to make sure I try and get to, but you know, then you go to court, and I go to jail for 14 days, and it just felt like I was just in the same vicious cycle constantly, same vicious cycle. But you know, without the Nelson's Trust, like, my life I wouldn't be here today. You know, they shone a light on me that I never expected that would be possible. And I'm hearing every single experience that you've put in this report. It is really touched my heart. And yeah, I just wanted to just really say that, you know, we got specialist interventions, we've got the women's services which are up and running, and we get quite a lot of women. We support 950 women a year here in the women's services in Swindon alone, and plus we got a lot of drop-ins and walk-ins. We never have a closed door policy, it's always open here. But yeah, there's a lot of work to still be done, a lot of training to be done with key workers. But I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be involved in this and actually share my experience, because I felt it, and I'm here now, saying there is hope and there is a choice and there is a way out. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmela, so much for that kind of really raw and honest account. It is really, really powerful, and I'm very confident that, well, I can see some clapping emojis coming out. I'm sure people feel pretty touched by what you had to say, and also grateful that you are using your experiences to change lives for other people. You only have to change the life of one person for it to create a cascade of intergenerational benefit. You'll be touching the lives of dozens of people by helping one, and it sounds like you're helping many people already. So just thank you so much. It's really, yeah, poignant. Difficult act to follow that, I'm afraid, for whoever comes next. Now, I can see, by the way, there's a couple of hands up. There absolutely will be a Q&A. So there is a Q&A on this agenda, and there's quite a bit of time for it. So if you've got questions for Carmela and anybody else, then we'll definitely come to those. So thanks for getting ahead there, because it's nothing worse than somebody doesn't have any questions. So thanks again, Carmela. Moving on to the next presentation, then, which is from the Nelson Trust as well. So Kirsty, you're up next.
Super. My name is Kirsty Day, and I'm the Director of Recovery at the Nelson Trust. That is a very tough act to follow, and Carmela did half of my job for me as well. So not only did she do her bit, she did half of my bit, which is wonderful. Firstly, what I think it's kind of really poignant to say is that the findings of this research absolutely marry with everything we have heard from women we have supported for almost 40 years, over and over and over. I don't think, you know, whilst services generally aren't necessarily set up in the ways that are recommended in this report, I don't think this is a surprise to most of us, because we've been hearing this over and over and over. So, you know, it's great to see yet more evidence that you know, from kind of research alongside the voices of the women that says women have specific needs, that you know, that there are different causal factors for women of substance misuse than there are for men, and what works for women is different than what works for men, first and foremost. So just, you know, a little bit about the Nelson Trust and kind of where we came from, how we kind of fit into this picture, so to speak. So we originated in 1985 and originally started with residential drug and alcohol treatment. In our later years, we opened up some Corston-inspired women's centres and operate women's centres across the southwest and Wales currently, and still have a predominantly women's only residential drug treatment service still based in our little heart in Brimscombe in Stroud in the Cotswolds. Essentially, over, I think it was probably 2002, we started to look at outcomes for women in our residential service and realized, we did a piece of research into you know, outcomes and experiences of women within our residential drug treatment, and found exactly what this report states. Women were struggling to even access treatment, primary caregiver for children being right up there as a major causal factor, seeking attachment with males in mixed gendered settings for security, for esteem, etc., which were causing dropouts, you know, from treatment. I can't stay, the relationship's broken down, etc. An alternate focus, if you will, from addressing that primary substance misuse need. And also that women were completing or trying to go through a treatment process that wasn't geared up to address their trauma. What we also realized with some follow-on research from that is that the engagement phase with women, particularly women with a dependency, it had to be earlier, it had to be in the community, and that those services had to be every bit as holistic, co-located, flexible, warm, approachable, and trauma reducing as this recommendation suggests. You know, so those services also needed to be set up by women for women, even in the building design. You know, they had to have policies, programs, processes, procedures, and people who actively, through every single action, avoid re-traumatization. A woman needs to know the second that she walks through the door that she's safe, without anybody having to tell her verbally that that's the case. And that can be achieved. And I appreciate that, you know, there are limitations on services of being able to build, you know, multi-million-pound kind of buildings that look a particular way, etc. But if you know, if we speak to the women themselves and ask them, how do we improve what we already have, very much has been done in this research, then, you know, service design looks completely different. And there are things that we as service providers wouldn't necessarily even consider that really matter to women, that things that are, you know, we would consider to be small wins. What does the lighting look like in winter when you're walking into the building or leaving the building at the end of the day? Does the timetable of, you know, trauma-informed, gender-responsive interventions actually lend itself to a mother who has to drop children off being able to attend? Do you have a creche on site? All of our women's centres have on-site creches, because, you know, a woman being a mother should never be a barrier to accessing recovery. Services that actively seek to heal the dehumanization of women's experiences. You know, a woman is most at risk across the course of her lifetime by those to whom she says, I love you. That risk factor doesn't change for women from childhood into adolescence or adulthood. She is most at risk across the course of her lifetime. So all of her trauma, the vast majority of which will have been perpetrated in the context of relationships, and conversely, her healing is facilitated in the context of relationships. Services, system, people, processes must be geared up to address that complete disconnection and dehumanization just by the tone of the delivery. And it's one of the things that's kind of central to our model. Other small things that make all the difference in the world is women not having to repeat their story over and over and over again. You know, actually, disclosure it can be an intervention within its own right when handled appropriately. If a woman's disclosure of her life history is viewed as a kind of non-commodity, she is far less likely to tell it again, far less likely to. Exactly as been said in the recommendation, women having the same gender key worker, absolutely crucial. The likelihood of women disclosing to males is exponentially reduced comparatively to, you know, the likelihood of disclosure to women. Flexible appointments, exactly as the, you know, with substance misusers, there are usually, and the report alludes itself to this, there are windows of opportunity that present themselves that are, more often than not, they are crisis induced. Those windows of opportunity are static. They operate for a very short period of time, and without responsive services being able to, you know, flex the approach, oftentimes a woman has, you know, she's had 7 different windows of opportunity that couldn't be capitalized on because service delivery wasn't built flexibly enough to kind of jump in, and all of the wraparound holistic support was put in place at the time to exit her from substance misuse, or barriers being in place, like we can't address your substance misuse until you address your mental health. We can't address your mental health until you address your substance misuse, which is, you know, a tale as old as time. You know, trying to place a woman, absolutely, as the report says, in a refuge with a substance misuse issue, incredibly difficult, almost impossible. If we have co-located services, if we have, you know, probation, health services, sexual health, if everybody's in the same buildings trying to achieve the same aim, that kind of whole system approach, exactly as our women's centres are set up, then actually 7 different needs can be met in one building in one day that might have taken her 7 weeks to address, with 9 different appointments, with 6 different people telling her story 15 different times. This makes sense. This makes absolute sense. And yeah, so, you know, it's good to see the recommendation around therapy like EMDR. It's a critical component of our women's only residential services, and women themselves speak about the power of a therapy like EMDR versus say talking therapy. Some of them fare better, to be fair, with talking therapy, so it doesn't feel like they're repeating their story over and over and over again. Just having choices for women of therapies that are incredibly effective, they are life altering, transformative, makes all the difference in the world. So, you know, just to kind of close, we set up our services basically because we knew that women themselves had told us for years that this is exactly what we needed to do. This is what it needed to look like, and we listened. And, you know, this is so exciting to see what's going to come next for the West Midlands. I know, you know, there are some services already in place that do fantastic, amazing work, but what will this lead on to? Really exciting times, and thanks for asking us to come along today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And you did a really good job of following on. It's obviously a different presentation, and it couldn't possibly defeat the previous one, but it was a different one, and your passion came across in the way you spoke about it, and your knowledge as well. So that really, really helpful, different contribution to the agenda. So brilliant. So this question is for this part of the agenda is for the people who are here. It's the Q&A. Now, the thing I probably should have said at the beginning, it's not too late, we've got half an hour, is ideally people would pop their questions into the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the top of the screen, and those will come to me, and for the smooth running of it, I'll read them out, and I basically read them out of the ones that have come to me soonest, and I've got some people helping moderating them. So that's the way to do it. If we run out of questions, I will have a quick peek to see if anybody's put their hand up, but ideally you'd use that Q&A function. And I do have a couple of backup questions myself, if that's what is required, but I'd rather go to yours first. So I'm going to kick start. So the first question that I've got in here is, did your research, this goes to the panel, by the way, this is to the people who've spoken, for the avoidance of doubt. Did your research cover women in prison and continuity of care arrangements when released from prison?
I'll jump in with that one. We didn't specifically target women who were on licence just because of the ethical approvals. However, when we visited some services, they had been recently released from prison, and they talked predominantly about drug and alcohol services, and they did comment that the continuity of care isn't really there, that there was issues in terms of getting a script. If they were given telephone numbers to be able to phone a service, they couldn't get through very often and really struggled with that. And so that was a really clear issue. And just finding accommodation when leaving prison can be a challenge for a woman. Many of the women talked about purposely not wanting to go back to an area that they already knew really well because of the connections that they had there. And they talked about some of the positives of relocating. And so for some of these women, there was real struggles in terms of appropriate accommodation and getting the support that they needed. We also had a number of professionals that had experience around the continuity of care as well, and highlighted that this is an ongoing issue.
Don't think
Did
I've
anyone
much
else?
to add
Sorry.
to what Sarah said there.
Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, I don't think there's much to add to what Sarah said there. I think she's covered it.
Okay, great.
Tom, can I also just jump in? I'm just mindful that there was a particular group of women that we chatted to that had a probation project that they were linked to that was a women's only service, fantastic project. But at the end of the woman's licence, she was automatically stopped from being in that service and had to then go into mixed gender treatment. So for some women, they were absolutely terrified of their licence coming to a close because they knew that that would mean that the support that they were getting, that they were finding particularly helpful, would come to a close, and then all of a sudden the increased vulnerability of mixed gender services would be upon them.
Yeah, a common theme, I'm afraid, across all sorts of different support services. Okay, now another question that's come in, which I think is a good one because it goes to one of the core recommendations really around co-location, the advantages of, and also to some of Kirsty's remarks around, you know, the advantages of having support in one place, particularly things that are just truly fundamental to it. So this question goes at a particular aspect of it, but of course the panel may elaborate if they wish to other aspects. So did your no, wrong part. What would good practice look like regarding swift access to trauma and mental health services? It's not specifically on co-location, but I imagine that might form part of some response. Kirsty, did you want to comment on kind of mental health provision, I guess, and how do you get it? Who's providing it? How fundamental is it?
So I mean, it's absolutely kind of fundamental. I think I appreciate that the difficulty for services it is that oftentimes the symptoms of substance misuse can mirror the symptoms of different, you know, mental illness. The problem is that when we don't even triage or won't even consider at all allowing a woman to access a service that she may need, you know, it's that classic chicken and egg scenario. If both services are working alongside each other to support and reduce the symptomology of substance misuse, trauma, and mental health, that can only be a good outcome. As it stands in some places, that doesn't happen. Until substance misuse is addressed, mental health services cannot step in. If mental health is a causal factor for substance misuse, the likelihood of substance misuse being addressed without mental health support is zero. So even triage addressing the length of time also that it can take for a woman to be triaged. We know if there's a window of opportunity that might last a week, even a woman being triaged during that time would be something. And then services being open to co-treating mental health alongside substance misuse, absolutely critical.
We found in our research that some women were waiting up to 3 to 4 years to get a clinical appointment. And quite frankly, that's disgusting. This issue of dual diagnosis and the support between mental health and drug use and that chasm that happens just has to stop. We have to stop making excuses, is my little rant, because it's just not appropriate. If we're looking at the context that these women have majority had trauma in their childhood, it is a given that there's mental health associated to that. And so to say this could be drugs masking, we need to stop that excuse, because if a woman has gone through trauma, she has mental health needs to process. She has that emotion that she needs to process. And we need to work in partnership around it, because as the women talked about, having to disclose the trauma in the first place is likely to escalate drug and alcohol. Having to wait huge amounts of time escalates drug and alcohol for appointments. And as you start treatment, you're going to have an escalation. So there needs to be that joint location and joint support in place for women. And if we don't start addressing the underlying issues around the trauma, all we're doing is failing women and putting them on that continuous cycle to get further damaged. And actually that's more expensive for services. So whilst it is expensive to do the kind of treatment that women need, it's cost effective in the long term.
And just to clarify there, I mean, I think you've kind of talked to it during the presentation so far, but did you come across some good practice of how they are ensuring that care is given quicker and in a way that helps?
One women's centre funded their own mental health counsellor on site. And so women accessing that service would start therapy within 2 weeks of being initially assessed in the service around the whole needs. And women said that they found that particularly helpful. A 2-week waiting list is amazing in comparison to the kind of treatment pathways that most services are experiencing.
Yeah, I echo that. I think there was actually not very much positive experience or practice to draw from, and where it was, it tended to be within the kind of voluntary sector through kind of co-location or additional provision, rather than people actually cracking the problem of improving access to the kind of core NHS mental health treatment services.
I've got some other good questions here, but I just really want to just underline this point about the mental health bit. A few speakers have mentioned how the will is there from a lot of practitioners and services to do things in the way that's been described, and sometimes we're up against barriers which are kind of structural and financial. But were you coming across any degree of kind of institutional cultural problems that could be in the short to medium term overcome in order to provide certain kinds of support without creating barriers or needing it to follow another particular treatment first?
I think there's clearly some cultural issues, Tom, in terms of the stigma. So the women saying that if they did end up in A&E, for example, because of being intoxicated and having an injury, they were treated in really disrespectful ways. And women's then ongoing interactions with the NHS and the criminal justice system and some third sector organisations too, and social workers. That whole self-awareness in practice around how we treating and how we speaking to people, I think does need to be addressed as a start point culturally. Whilst this project, we didn't specifically go into lots of detail around the issues around accessing the mental health, apart from to raise the issue. I'm aware in other services that some mental health professionals just won't even accept a referral from a fellow NHS member of staff who's working in the community sometimes. So I think there's some real barriers to accessing mental health services that at commissioner level and management level needs to be discussed and talked through to make it easier for services.
Yeah, thank you for that. So going on to one of the other questions, somebody says, you mentioned that you visited 3 services in the West Midlands to conduct your research, and they've just simply asked which services were these. Are you able to say that?
I think not. I mean, I think we wouldn't want to kind of single out any services for praise or criticism. This is rather a sort of attempt to kind of get a sense of how our service is being delivered rather than sort of holding anyone up for a stigma or a program. I would say that across all 3 services, we met lots of practitioners who are really passionate, really dedicated, and really doing their best given the kind of resource and institutional constraints.
I suppose one suggestion I could make is if afterwards you wanted to get in touch to know who an example of excellent practice was, then that might be an introduction that could possibly made, because it's always good to be able to speak to people who are known for doing something well. So that way you're definitely keeping it on the positive, but I'll leave that up to the person who asked the question.
Yeah, and just to add, for the women with lived experience, we accessed 4 different services for that.
Okay. So the next question, which complements the research, says great research. Did your research uncover any further aspects relating to access to services for ethnic minorities specifically? I know you did briefly touch upon that, but perhaps could elaborate. And were there any themes which differ between different ethnic groups?
Yeah, so it was an area that we struggled to explore because what we saw a lot of was practitioners trying to understand why they weren't seeing the numbers of ethnic minority clients that they would have expected. Given the makeup of the West Midlands, it's not surprising that the biggest focus was on women from South Asian communities. And there in particular, there was a sense of stigma and social pressure as a kind of a key barrier. A sense that women from those communities were particularly worried about the risk of an accidental disclosure if they were seen to be accessing services. So people talked about having experimented with, say, online provision of appointments, and that working particularly well for women who might really be very, very conscious of the need not to access services. I think really interestingly, we found that discussions about the best way to respond to particularly the needs of South Asian women were pulling in different directions. We heard some practitioners saying it's really important to, we do things like online access, which are about keeping them as discreet as possible, whereas other local authorities are exploring working more with kind of community-based organisations, even delivering kind of early interventions, educational interventions in kind of mosques or kind of community-based community centres. I don't think we necessarily got deep enough down into that area to say which of those we'd really recommend, but it was a kind of a notable tension between different perspectives. Other groups that were kind of mentioned as being less likely to engage were Eastern European women, and again, I think there was a kind of a consideration there of kind of high levels of social stigma, as well as potentially a kind of just a cultural reluctance to engage with any kind of support services, perhaps kind of even exacerbated by language barriers as well. But I think there's so much more work to do in this area.
In terms of the women that we spoke to, there was ethnic diversity within the population that we chatted to. A professional observation is that when we went into services that had white majority task force in terms of staff, they were the services that most of the women were white that we ended up speaking to. And services that we went to that had ethnic diversity in their workforce, interestingly had ethnic diversity in their service users that we spoke to. So that would just be a simple observation that I would make, that we haven't specifically spoken to in the context of the report. We have, in the context of report, captured the voice of women who said that they felt that there was additional stigmatisation around racism on top of their addictions, and how services interacted with them was derogatory and difficult and challenging, and that they were experiencing institutional racism. We also spoke to a woman from a Gypsy and Traveller community, and she talked about how within her community, going to an addiction service would be seen really negative, and talking about your issues in that community would also be seen really negative. And so again, thinking about signage and what you're calling your services, etc., is really important within that context.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I suppose my quick follow-up question on that would be, are there currently, from people here, any plans to research further some of these nuances and what good looks like for different groups and communities? Stephen, what about Centre for Justice Innovation? Is there any interest? Well, I'm sure you are interested, but is there any kind of anything bubbling under the surface?
Interest, yes. Have you got any money, Tom? What I would say is that we do have a kind of planned follow-up piece of work, and we're really looking forward to working with service users in the Nelson Trust to think about what good looks like, not only in delivery of treatment, but in delivery of treatment in constellation with other services that will benefit women. And absolutely within that, we'd hope to deepen our understanding of what works for women for different communities, but it's not a project which is explicitly based for which working in different communities is the starting point. And I think I'd really love to have a project like that from us or from someone else as well. Okay, well, I think I'm very enthusiastic about having a conversation about that after today, and seeing whether we've got funding or whether we can get somebody else to stump up, maybe in partnership, match fund, whatever, because I think it needs doing. So thanks for that question there. The other question, which is a really, really good one, and I'll give a little part of an answer to it, but then we'll go for a broader answer because it has wider applicability. How will the recommendations following this research actually filter out into drug and alcohol treatment services? Which is a really important question. Otherwise, it goes back to that point I made at the introduction. It's just another really great piece of research on a shelf that goes dusty. So locally in the West Midlands, we've been working closely with everybody involved in the research to hold practical workshops with regional commissioners. I think some of them are here, and that's just to really talk about the detail of what they already do, what they could do, what the barriers are. And we've held 2 of those because we held a follow-up to see if there's any progress made or to kind of talk about new nuances. And I think they've been really excellent conversations, actually, because you just get a sense that some little bits here and there will change as a result, and plans for bigger changes. So we will carry on looking to keep that conversation going so that it doesn't get lost. But to the panel, have you given thoughts about, in terms of the national picture and how we keep pushing this in a way where the research is put to good use?
I'm having conversations in the locality that I'm based with commissioners about this research and sharing findings, and I'm really thrilled that so many people from the locality that I'm based in are on the call. So thank you so much for joining. That means that we all have a common start point in terms of where we're working for to move that forward within our locality and look at having women's only services reinstated. What you said right at the beginning, Tom, the budget cuts that everyone has experienced over the last decade have decimated services, and some fantastic women's projects that previously were in operation over a decade ago when funding was a little better, they have all been lost. And so to start re-establishing some of that best practice will be fantastic. And then the other thing that we're looking at the moment is writing a piece for probation quarterly so that we can get information out to probation officers and the criminal justice system. So that special edition will go out in December that we're working on at the moment. And myself and Stephen presented at HMPPS Insights Festival earlier on this week as well, to get it out there in terms of HMPPS.
Yeah, for people who know the Centre for Justice Innovation, you'll know that we like to, we worry all the time about the report on a shelf problem, so we like to stick with our research once it's out there. And in this case, I think we've really identified local authority commissioners are the people with the most capacity to kind of take this forward. So I'm handing over next to my colleagues Lydia and Suzanne, who are also on the call, who are actually going to be producing a piece of guidance specifically for local authority commissioners on how they can improve the way that women access treatment in their areas. And then once that's out, we're not going to let that sit on the shelf either. We're going to go out and talk to people in as many areas as possible. Also, I see the questions from Tony Russell. I should say thank you very much, Tony, because your advice in the early parts of this project was really helpful in helping us frame this, and you've been a really useful source of expertise throughout the project. So I'm glad you're here, and we're really grateful for all your help.
Thank you. Okay, there's one more question in the Q&A box, and I did see somebody else with their hand up, and I might give them the privileged position of asking it themselves. But first, I'll just go to this really important question, actually. One of the last ones here is many women we work with have had multiple children removed and will find it difficult to attend appointments where there might be creche facilities. Did this come across in your research? I mean, the silence suggests perhaps it didn't, but Stephen?
Sorry,
I'd really like to ask Kirsty what she thinks on this issue, because this must be something that you've had to deal with.
Sorry, double mic. Kirsty's having a few technical issues, so I'm going to have to stand in for her. We actually, as part of some of our women's centres, also deliver a project called Pause, and that is specifically for women who have had multiple removals and they take a pause from pregnancy. And it was kind of one of our challenges when we set up that project from our women's centres, because our women's centres all have creches. And actually, we found it quite a positive experience for the women on those projects that were able to kind of give their experiences to other women who may have kind of social care involvement. It didn't kind of hamper their experiences of coming into our women's centres at all. It actually had quite a reparative process for the women accessing, but we did consider it. But kind of from all of our women's centres, we do also have the opportunity to, you know, use other doors and other sideways. So, you know, those women don't have to come into contact if they, you know, are experiencing those kind of challenges at the beginning. But we haven't had a major, you know, issue about it at all, but we did consider it.
We had one woman that specifically said that if it was a service where children were on site, they would find that really triggering for the amount of times they've had children removed. Other women didn't jump in and say, yes, I would find the same, but that certainly does need a little bit of thought, and having choice, whether that be a service with a creche and then a service where children aren't present, is great then to be able to women to safeguard themselves in that particular situation.
Right, we're running out of time now. We'll have to draw to a close very soon. Now, looking at the questions, and a few more came in, there's a couple of points in there asking about the lived experience component again. So I think they're interested in, I can't quite recall to what detail this goes into in the report, but talking a bit more about the methodology and how that was done, I think will be of interest. So I would say go to the report in the first instance, but perhaps if there's follow-up queries about more detail about how that part was done and how it was collaborative and co-produced, then those questions could be asked outside the meeting. And somebody has also given a name and email address about their interest in a potential project. So got a nodded head there. So I think we'll make sure we've recorded that information in the Q&A. So that we can get in touch with you afterwards. Is that right, Stephen? Yep, thumbs up. So that's captured. So that point has been addressed. One person has just said, why is it taking so long for action to address these issues when they've been known about and they're at the bottom of the pile? I would say a couple of things. I mean, just my perspective, one, the point's been made here that at once upon a time, I don't think anyone here is pretending it's ever been brilliant, but there were better services in place and more specific services in place. And it's not a party political point, it's just a comment on facts about what austerity has done. Some people may feel austerity was necessary, some may not. That's another debate. But austerity has ravaged some of these services, so it has got worse. So I wouldn't say it's a case of it's never had attention, it's got worse. But I do think my sense in the many different kind of policy circles and community and public sector circles I work in, there is kind of just a growing appreciation of the scale of domestic abuse and sexual abuse. I mean, obviously many people have known about it before because they are the victims of it, but just a growing strategic appreciation of just how serious this issue is, and therefore how intertwined it is with women who find themselves either with addiction or caught in justice. And therefore, I feel it's been raised higher up and not at the bottom of the pile, but it will need research like this and people in this room to keep pushing at it, because new big crises do suddenly take precedent, or new moral panics, and then this really important work can get forgotten. So there's not going to be a quick fix, but I don't think it's the case that people don't care and that it's something that we shouldn't have hope for. That's why this research is so important. I think that kind of addresses some of those extra comments, but like I say, people can get back in touch afterwards. I think somebody else is just giving a really complimentary remark about Carmela's presentation as well, which I'm sure lots of people shared. I suspect some of the hands that went up at that point were to say that. So I'm going to close now very briefly because it's almost at time. And I don't want to oversimplify this research, but for me, what really comes through is just really compassion being at the very, very core of how we treat people who are in crisis, not treating them as though they are bad people, treating them for what they are, which is human beings in crisis, and nearly always the victim of mistreatment and abuse and disrespect. And if you can find a way through persistence and kindness for somebody's self-esteem to be rebuilt slowly, there really are great futures for people even in the most awful situations. And I think, you know, the experiences that have been spoken about here kind of show that, and that justifies all this work. And going forward, it justifies it because a really good outcome is possible. So thanks so much for everybody who's taken the time to come and hear about this research, and obviously the presenters and everything. It's a privilege for me to be able to learn more about it, hear about it, and be involved in it. And like I say, there's a few comments that have been put in the box. Get in touch afterwards with us, and anyone else who wants to get in touch, please do, and we'll do our very best to engage in what you're asking about. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carmela.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everybody.